a man between power and betrayal. It was the end of the 5th-10th century. In a glorious empire of the East, the pungent odor of passion, fear, and rivalry reigned within the palace walls. In this palace, there was a man who was known for his justice and grew in the eyes of the people and the palace with his knowledge. Although his name has been erased in documents today, in the language of the people he was known by only one title, the wise Vizier. It was not his wealth, his throne, or the nobility of his lineage that made him so powerful. On the contrary, he was born into an ordinary family and educated himself through years of madrasa education. Attracting the attention of the state at a young age, this man quickly rose in the palace hierarchy thanks to his intelligence, analytical nature, and populist attitude. During his vizierate, he abolished unjust taxes, restructured the debts of poor peasants, and introduced legal regulations to reduce palace bribery. But every reform, every improvement was in someone else's interest. And it was here that the battle between good and evil, righteousness and intrigue began. The rise of the wise vizier began to unsettle many nobles and even some princes, because he was no longer just a statesman. He had become a symbol of hope and justice in the eyes of the people. This meant danger for those closest to the throne. The greatest threat was in the eyes of a young and ambitious prince. This prince believed that in the future he would be the sole claimant to the throne, and the growing influence of the vizier threatened his plans. In recent times, the monarch had begun to listen more to the vizier's opinion, even in matters of state. The vizier had the last word in palace meetings, and even foreign envoys sought his opinion. The prince and the vested interest group around him first started to spread small rumors. The vizier is turning the people against the monarch. He is undermining loyalty in the name of reform. He is preparing the ground for an uprising by binding the people to him. In time, these rumors penetrated the stone walls of the palace and reached the ear of the monarch. At first, the king paid no heed to these words, because the vizier was his childhood friend. They had grown up together and learned from the same teacher. But once the human mind comes into contact with doubt, it begins to see every silence as a crime, every silence as betrayal. The queen was aware of what was happening. He saw the trap set before his eyes, the gossip in his ears, the whispered conversations in the palace chambers. But he was confident. He had served for so many years, risked his life for the state. He believed that as long as he did not deviate from justice and truth, nothing would harm him. But alas, no matter how righteous you are in history, if you are alone in the fight against power, your end is certain. One night, with a silent order, action was taken. The vizier's mansion was besieged. He was blindfolded and his hands were chained without any explanation. No explanation came from the palace, nor did the people learn what had happened to him. Because this was not just an arrest. This was a liquidation operation planned long in advance. The allegations were ready. Leaking state secrets to foreign ambassadors, attempting to poison the monarch, claiming the throne. When the vizier faced these accusations, he could only smile bitterly, because he knew very well not what he was accused of, but why he was accused. Neither the service he had given in the past, nor the battles he had won, nor the love of the people meant anything anymore. Once you are targeted, the system starts to grind you down. And that moment came. He was taken to the dungeon, knowing that he would never see the sun again. He would be punished not only with hatred, but also with silence. But the worst was yet to come. When the vizier was detained by the palace guards one night, he was given neither a defense nor an explanation. His eyes were blindfolded with a black cloth. As his feet were dragged in chains, his footsteps echoing in every corridor he passed were the last traces of the life he would leave behind. They took him down to a dungeon on the lower floors of the palace, soaked with dampness, its stone walls covered with moss. This dungeon was a special place reserved for enemies of the state. Most of those who fell in here either never saw the light of day again, or were dehumanized when they came out. The first night was silent. There was no interrogation, no conversation, only despair trapped between stone walls and questions boiling inside. The queen knew why she was here, but he still harbored a hope in his heart. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe the ruler would understand everything. But as the days passed, this hope began to give way to a silent collapse. Sunlight never touched his cell. He had lost the concept of time. He didn't know how many days he had been there. Only the coldness of the stone floor, The weight of the chains and the faint screams of torture at night served as a clock. On the third, or maybe the fifth night, the iron door opened with a great noise. 3 men with thick necks and scars on their faces entered. With them was the chief advisor, said to be an old friend, but there was no longer friendship in their eyes, only an expression of ruthless duty. The interrogation began. First, it was alleged that he had given state secrets to enemy ambassadors. Then he was said to have held secret meetings inside the palace. The vizier denied every one of them. His answers were clear, they were logical. But the purpose of these questions was not to find the truth, but to bring him down. The more he answered, a slap in the face. As he resisted, a stick to his ribs. As he continued to speak, blows to his knees and feet. The tortures were not only physical. They told him that his family was dead, that the names of his children had been erased, that the people hated him, that even mentioning his name was forbidden in the palace. And these lies pierced his mind like bullets. After a point, one does not get used to pain. One becomes exhausted. The vizier also began to burn out. He was dreaming at night. At times, he thought he was in the palace like in the old days, and then he woke up to the cold reality of the chains. Sometimes he prayed, sometimes he cried out, but mostly he kept silent. Because in this dungeon, those who hoped were punished the most. He was told over and over again, "Confess your guilt and we will spare your life," because he was not guilty. But the vizier kept silent, and this belief had become a burden even heavier than pain. One night, an old friend was lowered into the dungeon. He had once worked shoulder to shoulder with him, and they had achieved many successes. Now he had become a man of the palace and had come to persuade him. "The game is over," he said. "Confess, even if you are not guilty, at least you will save your life. You might even be given a new assignment, but if you keep quiet, they will throw you alive into the cauldron." "Are you really worthy of this fate?" The queen slowly raised her eyes. "It doesn't matter if you kill me," he said, "nor if you silence me. But if an innocent man is silenced like this, the conscience of this empire will never speak again." That night his friend left, the cloaked figure being pulled back up a rope from the dungeon shaft, leaving the prisoner alone in darkness, and the vizier realized that his end was now certain. The next days were spent more in the torture of waiting than in physical torture. He had heard that the cauldron was being prepared. Special masters had been summoned to the palace. A large square was being prepared and crowds were expected to gather. This punishment would be carried out in full view of the people and would serve as an example to others. And when the moment came, the vizier neither shouted nor begged for mercy, because it was no longer the body, but the soul that had been taken. As the day dawned, there was a strange silence in the inner courtyard of the palace. The edict had been announced the night before. The greatest enemy of the state will be punished in the presence of the people. A name was circulating in the minds, that great man who was once praised for his justice and bowed with respect as he walked down the street. Now he had been declared a traitor and his execution was awaited. A large cauldron was placed in the courtyard. Firewood was stacked under it, and palace soldiers stood guard at its 4 corners. The cauldron was filled with water, and the fire underneath had been burning since the early hours of the morning, and the cauldron began to boil slowly. At first, the people gathered with curiosity. Who would be punished? What crime had he committed? Whispers spread. He will be made a vizier. No, they won't do that. They say he committed treason. Maybe he deserved it, but no one could be sure, because that man was a symbol of the people's faith and justice. Towards noon, the heavy iron gate of the dungeon opened. The vizier was escorted out by 2 soldiers. His chains were still on his wrists, his hair disheveled, his eyes sunken, but his head was erect. The crowd became silent. Because no one knew how to react at that moment, the palace spokesman stepped forward. He read the edict. This man, who used the Grand Vizier's office for his own interests, who leaked state secrets to the enemy, who betrayed his sovereign, will be punished in the presence of the people with the most severe punishment as per the law. The vizier did not say a word. For a moment it was expected that the monarch would appear on the balcony and say a last word, but no one appeared. Because no one dared to mention his name even in the palace anymore. He was brought to the cauldron. 2 executioners took him by the arms and led him to the edge of the cauldron. The water was now boiling and the sound of bubbling echoed. Some of the people closed their eyes. Some began to weep. Others watched in silence, because at such moments emotions freeze. One of the executioners asked one last time, "What is your last word?" The vizier turned his eyes to the crowd. A child, a woman, an old man. One by one, he looked at everyone, and he said a single sentence: "Betrayal is punished with fire, but the real fire burns with injustice." And then, slowly, he was lowered into the cauldron. The sound of the water rose. There was no scream of pain that came at first. There was no scream of pain that came at first, because for him, this was the execution of the soul, not the body. A man who had lived with justice all these years, killed by injustice. This was the real tragedy. After the execution was complete, the executioners dispersed. The fire at the cauldron began to die down. The people slowly left, but each one walked with a weight. Everyone who was there that day could not forget that image for the rest of their lives, because some deaths take more than a body. After the queen was killed alive in a boiling cauldron, there was silence behind the palace walls. That morning, in the palace courtyard, there was usually the bustle of business, the tramp of horses and the bustle of servants. But now everyone was silent and conversations were whispered and laughter faded. The palace was digging the grave of its conscience. The monarch did not leave his chambers for days after the execution. Some said it was remorse, others said it was not the monarch who made the decision, but the intrigues around him. But there was only one thing that changed the truth. The vizier was dead, and no excuse could mitigate the tragedy. After the vizier's death, tax rates increased, the old system of bribery returned, and those seeking justice began to return empty-handed from the palace gates. The people began to understand why the vizier had been killed, because he was a symbol of justice. And those who reminded them of justice were always the most dangerous for palaces built on tyranny. Years after the vizier's death, his name was erased from official records. His name was not mentioned in schools, and palace officials were forbidden to speak of him. It was as if he had never lived. But he lived. He lived with his justice, his honor, his upright stance. He is best remembered for his quiet death. Neither a tombstone nor a statue was erected for the vizier, but his name became a household term, standing like a queen. Over time, her story was kept alive with different names while telling fairy tales to children. Her courage came to life again at different times and through different people. Each time she was reminded that justice has a price.